How is a monster created? Is it born from the cruelty of a violent childhood, or forged in the absolute grip of power? For over 30 years, one man held an entire nation in his fist. He was a modernizer who built schools, and a murderer who gassed his own people. He defied superpowers, waged devastating wars, and built a terrifying cult of personality. This is the story of Saddam Hussein's rise from a dusty village to an opulent palace, and his ultimate fall into a hole in the ground. Origins and influences, 1937 to 1958. The individual known to history as Saddam Hussein was born on the 28th of April, 1937. His birthplace was the small village of Alauja, located near the city of Tikrit, northwest of Baghdad, Iraq. His father, Hussein Abd al-Majid, was a peasant sheep herder from the Albu Nasser tribe. Accounts of his father's fate vary. Some suggest he abandoned the family prior to Saddam's birth, though it is more probable that he died of throat cancer in late 1936 or early 1937. Saddam's mother was Subha Tulfa al-Musallat. Her family came from a more respected lineage, tracing its ancestry to a former governor of the Tikrit region. The family had already been struck by tragedy, as a son born to Subha and Hussein had died shortly before Saddam's arrival. Following her husband's death, Subha remarried a man named Ibrahim al-Hassan. This union produced several half-siblings for Saddam, though he would have limited contact with them. Saddam's relationship with his mother was strained. Having tried to terminate the pregnancy after her first husband's death, she reportedly never showed affection for her son. His youth was shaped by this difficult familial background. His stepfather, Ibrahim al-Hassan, was a harsh disciplinarian who subjected Saddam to severe physical abuse. The beatings were so extreme that as a child, Saddam absconded from his family home and went to live with his maternal uncle, Khairallah Talfa, who resided in the capital, Baghdad.
You cannot understand the man without understanding the child. This early life of rejection and brutality is a classic formative narrative for many 20th century authoritarians. It teaches a brutal lesson that the world is a hostile place, and security only comes from inflicting pain, never from receiving it. This deep-seated paranoia, this belief that he was surrounded by enemies, started right there in his own home.
There, he was enrolled in the Al-Khar Secondary School and later began to study law. His uncle Khairallah, a fervent Arab nationalist, became the primary influence on his formative years. Despite this move, Saddam maintained his connection to Tikrit, and decades later, as the ruler of Iraq, he would elevate many family and tribal members from the area to positions of significant authority. Saddam Hussein grew up during a period of profound transformation across the Middle East. For centuries, the region had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. However, by the early 20th century, Ottoman power had declined, and following its collapse after World War I, the victorious European powers, Britain and France, redrew the map of the region. The modern state of Iraq was formed by combining three distinct Ottoman provinces, forcing disparate ethnic and religious groups together. The Kingdom of Iraq was granted nominal independence in 1932 under King Faisal I, but British influence remained paramount. Britain retained significant control over the country's administration and, crucially, its vast oil fields through the largely British-controlled Iraqi Petroleum Company. This quasi-colonial status fostered widespread resentment and fueled the rise of new political ideologies. Chief among them was Pan-Arabism, which advocated for the unification of Arab states to throw off foreign domination. From this ideological ferment emerged the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. Founded in the 1940s, Ba'athism espoused a secular, nationalist, and socialist doctrine. It called for the Arab world to rid itself of imperialism and unite to restore the prominence it had enjoyed centuries earlier. For an ambitious young man like Saddam, shaped by a sense of grievance, the Ba'ath Party was a natural political home. He officially joined in 1957.
In those days, to be young and patriotic was to be Ba'athist. We felt a deep shame about our country. The British drew lines on a map and called it Iraq, but they still controlled our oil, our destiny. The Ba'ath Party gave us a voice. It spoke of pride, of unity, of an Arab nation rising from the ashes. For a young man like myself and for Saddam, it was more than politics. It was a promise of dignity.
The Bathist Ascent, 1958 to 1968. The political situation in Iraq reached a tipping point in 1958. On the 14th of July, a group of military officers, led by General Abd al-Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, staged a coup d'etat. They overthrew the monarchy, executing King Faisal II and establishing the Republic of Iraq. The Ba'ath Party initially supported this revolution, seeing it as a victory over Western influence. However, a rift soon developed. The Baathists were strong proponents of Pan-Arabism and wanted Iraq to join the newly formed United Arab Republic, a political union between Egypt and Syria. General Qasim refused, prioritizing Iraqi nationalism over a Pan-Arab state. In response to what they viewed as a betrayal, the Baathists resolved to assassinate Qasim. Saddam Hussein, by then a committed party militant, was selected as a member of the hit squad. On the 7th of October, 1959, the team ambushed Qasim's car in Baghdad. They fired on the vehicle, and although Qasim was wounded, he survived the attack. Saddam sustained a bullet wound to his leg, but managed to escape, fleeing first to Syria and subsequently to Egypt, where he remained in exile. The early 1960s in Iraq were marked by political instability. In February 1963, Ba'athist elements within the army staged another coup, known as the Ramadan Revolution. This time, they were successful. Qasim was overthrown and executed. The Baathists held power, but only for 9 months. In November 1963, a former ally of Qasim, Abdul Salam Arif, led a counter-coup that purged the Baathists from government.
This period of coup and counter-coup was not unique to Iraq. It was the violent birth pangs of the post-colonial world. The old powers had left a vacuum, and various factions, nationalists, communists, pan-Arabists, were fighting to fill it. Power wasn't won at the ballot box, it was won with the loyalty of a tank battalion. This environment rewards ruthlessness and conspiracy, skills Saddam was mastering, even from a prison cell.
Saddam, who had returned to Iraq after the Ramadan Revolution, was arrested and imprisoned. During his time in jail, he solidified his status within the party, becoming recognized as a formidable organizer. It was also during this period, in 1963, that he entered into an arranged marriage with his first cousin, Sajida Talfa, a union designed to strengthen his familial and tribal alliances. The Consolidation of Power, 1968 to 1979. The Ba'ath Party's definitive ascent to power began with the 17th of July Revolution in 1968. Widespread instability across the Middle East, exacerbated by the Arab defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel, had weakened the Iraqi government. The Baathists, led by General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, seized control of the state. Al-Bakr became president, but the man appointed as his deputy, a 31-year-old Saddam Hussein, would quickly become the true power behind the regime. As vice president, Saddam focused on modernizing Iraq and consolidating his control. He spearheaded the 1972 nationalization of the country's oil industry, wresting control from the Iraqi Petroleum Company and directing the nation's massive oil revenues into state projects. This wealth funded ambitious social programs, He launched a comprehensive literacy campaign that significantly reduced illiteracy rates for both men and women. He also oversaw the establishment of a system of universal basic healthcare. These modernization efforts earned him formal recognition from UNESCO.
I saw it with my own eyes. Villages that never had a doctor suddenly had a clinic. Children whose parents could not read or write were going to new schools. For a time, it felt like the dream was real. We were building a new Iraq, a strong Iraq. Saddam understood that power came not just from the gun, but from giving the people something tangible. It was a social contract, your loyalty in exchange for progress. For many years, people were willing to make that trade.
Concurrently, Saddam was building a vast and ruthless internal security apparatus. Paramilitary organizations and secret police bodies, like the Mukhabarat, were established to monitor the population and eliminate political dissidents. In 1974, the regime faced a major internal conflict with the outbreak of the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War, a conflict fueled by American and Iranian support for Kurdish separatists led by Mustafa Barzani. The Bathist government eventually suppressed the uprising. In 1976, Saddam was promoted to the rank of general within the Iraqi army, further solidifying his position. By the late 1970s, President al-Bakr began to suspect Saddam was moving to secure absolute power. In an effort to sideline him, al-Bakr entered into negotiations with the Bathist regime in Syria to merge the two countries. The proposed plan would have made Syrian President Hafez al-Assad the successor to al-Bakr, effectively blocking Saddam's path. Saddam moved preemptively. On the 16th of July, 1979, he compelled the aging and ill al-Bakr to resign from the presidency. Saddam Hussein was now the official head of state. To cement his authority, he immediately initiated a violent purge. On the 22nd of July, 1979, he convened a conference of Ba'ath Party officials. During the meeting, Saddam announced he had uncovered a fifth column within the party, conspiring to overthrow the Iraqi state. A coerced party member, Muhi Abdul Hussein, was brought forward to confess his role in the alleged plot and proceeded to read out a list of 68 co-conspirators. As each name was called, the accused was removed by armed guards. The purge was filmed. In the aftermath, dozens of senior party members were executed, consolidating Saddam's position as the undisputed and absolute ruler of Iraq.
I was a junior officer, but I knew men who were in that hall. The purge of '79, that was the day the dream died. It was pure terror. One moment you were cheering for your comrade, the next he was named a traitor, and you were cheering for Saddam to survive, weeping with gratitude that it was not you. After that day, there was no more party. There was only Saddam, and there was only fear.
The 1979 purge was political theater of the most horrifying kind, straight from Stalin's playbook. Its purpose was not just to eliminate rivals, but to make the remaining members complicit. By forcing them to watch and even participate in the denunciations, he bound them to him through a shared public crime. It was a masterclass in establishing totalitarian control.
This event marked the beginning of his totalitarian dictatorship. We are now at a pivotal moment. The ruthless politician has become an absolute tyrant, and the path forward is one of war and genocide. It's a dark turn in this story. As we prepare to document the brutal conflicts to come, we want to take a moment to thank you for joining us. If you find value in these detailed historical accounts, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these critical stories to light. The Dictator at War, 1979 to 1990. Having secured absolute power in 1979, Saddam Hussein's rule became that of an authoritarian tyrant. Through paramilitary organizations, like the Iraqi Popular Army and secret police agencies such as the Mukhabarat, he initiated a reign of terror that would last for over 2 decades. Society was subjected to widespread monitoring for political dissidents, and groups such as the Kurdish minority and certain Shia Muslim factions were actively persecuted. A pervasive cult of personality was constructed, with his image displayed prominently throughout the country. 2 staged national elections were held during his rule, one in 1995 and another in 2002, in which Hussein allegedly received nearly 100% of the vote. Such spectacles were a staple of many 20th century dictatorships, designed to project an image of popular support and invincibility. A major international challenge emerged almost immediately after Saddam's consolidation of power. In 1979, the neighboring state of Iran underwent a revolution that overthrew its Western-backed monarchy and established an Islamic republic under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The new Iranian regime was founded on a revolutionary Shia Islamic ideology. The Bathist government in Iraq, which was secular and dominated by the Sunni minority, viewed this development as a significant threat. There was concern that Khomeini's followers would attempt to undermine the Iraqi state by appealing to Iraq's Shia majority population. Hostilities escalated quickly, driven by territorial disputes and ideological animosity. On the 22nd of September 1980, believing Iran to be in a state of revolutionary chaos and thus vulnerable, Saddam Hussein ordered an invasion of Iran. The primary objective was to seize control of the oil-rich Khuzestan province. This marked the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. The Iraqi leadership's expectation of a swift victory proved to be a severe miscalculation. The Iranian regime mobilized its population, and the conflict devolved into a protracted war of attrition.
The war with Iran was a catastrophe. We were told it would be over in weeks. 8 years later, we had lost an entire generation. We were soldiers, we followed orders, but we saw the endless lines of coffins. Saddam could not accept defeat, so he just kept feeding the fire with the bodies of our young men. It was a war born of ego and paid for with our blood.
The fighting was characterized by trench warfare and large-scale infantry assaults, resulting in extremely high casualties. Iraq received significant financial and military aid from other Gulf Arab states, as well as tacit support from the Soviet Union and Western powers, including the United States, who feared the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution. By the mid-1980s, Iranian forces had launched successful counteroffensives, pushing Iraqi troops back and even making incursions into Iraqi territory, particularly around the city of Basra. The conflict became notorious for 2 specific elements of brutality. Iraq made widespread use of chemical weapons, including mustard gas and the nerve agent sarin, particularly when facing strategic setbacks. On the Iranian side, the widespread use of child soldiers led to the deaths of tens of thousands of teenagers on the battlefield. After 8 years of devastating conflict, with casualty estimates ranging from 500,000 to over 1 million dead, the war concluded in a stalemate. A ceasefire was agreed upon in August 1988, with no significant territorial changes for either side. Both regimes claimed victory, but the war had been economically and demographically catastrophic for both nations. Saddam Hussein used the closing stages of the war with Iran as a screen for a campaign against Iraq's Kurdish minority in the north. The Kurds, an ethnic group with a long history of seeking autonomy or independence, were viewed by the regime as a security threat. In 1988, the Iraqi government launched the Anfal campaign, a series of military operations that amounted to a program of genocide. The campaign involved the systematic destruction of thousands of Kurdish villages, mass deportations, and the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations, most infamously in the town of Halabja. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds were killed during the Anfal campaign.
People in the West hear chemical weapons and think of soldiers. We think of our children. I was a girl in Halabja. I remember the smell like sweet apples. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. They weren't fighting an army. They were trying to erase our existence, our songs, our language, our people. For us, Anfal is not a campaign. It is the defining wound, the wound that never, ever heals.
The invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. The war with Iran left Iraq with one of the largest armies in the world, but also with massive debts, particularly to its neighboring Gulf states of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam demanded that these debts be forgiven, arguing that Iraq had protected the Arabian Peninsula from the Iranian Revolution. He also accused Kuwait of depressing oil prices by overproducing and of illegally slant drilling oil from the Rumaila field, which straddles the Iraq-Kuwait border. Based on the mistaken belief that his former allies in the West would not intervene, Saddam Hussein made the decision to invade Kuwait. On the 2nd of August 1990, Iraqi forces launched a full-scale invasion. Most of Kuwait was under Iraqi control within a day. Shortly thereafter, Saddam declared Kuwait to be the 19th province of Iraq, a move that would simultaneously absolve Iraq of its debt to Kuwait and grant it control over another oil-rich region. He further inflamed tensions by refusing to allow Western citizens in Iraq to leave the country, effectively holding them as hostages. The international response was swift and condemnatory. The United Nations Security Council passed a series of resolutions demanding Iraq's withdrawal. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, assembled a large international coalition to oppose the invasion. Saudi Arabia, fearing it could be the next target of Iraqi aggression, allowed coalition forces to use its territory as a staging ground. When Saddam refused to comply with the UN deadline for withdrawal, the coalition launched a military counteroffensive. On the 17th of January 1991, the coalition forces launched Operation Desert Storm. The campaign began with a sustained and technologically advanced aerial bombardment that targeted Iraq's military infrastructure, command and control centers, and air defenses. After several weeks of air attacks, a ground offensive was initiated on the 24th of February. The coalition ground campaign lasted for approximately 100 hours. The Iraqi army, which had been severely degraded by the air war, offered disorganized resistance and was swiftly defeated. Coalition forces liberated Kuwait and inflicted heavy casualties on the retreating Iraqi military. However, the coalition's mandate was limited to the liberation of Kuwait. President Bush made the decision not to extend the war into Iraqi territory or to seek the deposition of Saddam Hussein as leader of Iraq. Consequently, despite the comprehensive military defeat, Saddam's regime remained in power.
The invasion of Kuwait was Saddam's greatest geopolitical blunder. He was a master of internal Iraqi politics, but he was dangerously ignorant of the world outside. He completely misread the end of the Cold War. He still believed he could play East against West, but that world was gone. He thought the world that armed him against Iran would let him swallow Kuwait. It was a fatal combination of arrogance and ignorance.
When the Americans stopped, we could not believe it. Our army was shattered. We were expecting them in Baghdad within days. We thought the regime was finished. When they stopped, it was a miracle for Saddam. He immediately declared it a great victory, that he had faced the entire world and survived, and in a way he had.
The Sanctions Era, 1991-2001. Following the Gulf War, the United Nations imposed a wide range of comprehensive economic sanctions on Iraq. The stated purpose of these sanctions was to compel the Iraqi regime to comply with UN resolutions, which included the full disclosure and dismantling of its programs for weapons of mass destruction, WMD. Throughout the 1990s, the sanctions had a devastating effect on the Iraqi economy and led to a severe humanitarian crisis, with widespread shortages of food and medicine. While the Iraqi economy was in shambles, Saddam Hussein's political power became more entrenched.
The 90s were a slow death. My brother had cancer, but we couldn't get the medicine. The hospitals had nothing. The sanctions were meant to punish him, but he and his sons lived in palaces. We, the people, were the ones who paid the price. We were trapped, between a dictator who wouldn't yield and a world that was starving us to make him.
This is the terrible paradox of sanctions against a totalitarian regime. They rarely achieve their primary goal. Instead, they give the dictator absolute control over all remaining resources. Saddam controlled who got food, who got medicine. It became the ultimate tool of patronage and punishment, strangling any potential opposition and making the populace completely dependent on the very regime the world was trying to pressure.
The sanctions regime gave him centralized control over the distribution of all imported goods, which he used to reward loyalists and punish opponents. During this decade, the dictatorial nature of the Hussein family became even more pronounced, particularly through the actions of Saddam's two sons, Uday and Qusay. Qusay, the younger son, was positioned as Saddam's probable successor and placed in charge of the elite Republican Guard. He was responsible for brutally crushing a Shiite Muslim uprising in southern Iraq in the immediate aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War. Uday, the elder son, became notorious for his erratic and violent behavior, including allegations of torture and sexual assault. A failed assassination attempt in 1996 left him partially disabled, but did not temper his excesses. As Iraq became increasingly isolated, Saddam Hussein began to author several novels, including Zabiba and the King, an allegorical work widely believed to have been written by him. During this period, Iraq's relationship with UN weapons inspectors was contentious. While Iraq had been forced to give up its chemical weapons after the Gulf War, UN inspectors in the mid-1990s discovered evidence of post-war efforts to produce biological and chemical agents, such as anthrax and sarin gas. However, by the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, subsequent UN inspections indicated that Saddam's regime had largely dismantled these programs, though a definitive conclusion was hampered by Iraqi obstruction. This raises one of the most difficult questions of international policy. Were the sanctions a necessary tool to contain a dictator or a cruel punishment of an innocent population? It's a debate that continues to this day. We'd be interested to read your perspective in the comments below. Downfall, capture, and execution, 2001 to 2006. The global political landscape shifted dramatically following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, in the United States. The administration of President George W. Bush launched a war on terror, beginning with an invasion of Afghanistan. Subsequently, the administration turned its focus toward Iraq. Senior officials in Washington asserted that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, presenting Iraq as an imminent threat to international security. While there was no credible evidence to support a link between Saddam's secular government and Al-Qaeda, the argument that Iraq retained WMDs became the primary justification for military action. Despite significant international opposition, including from allies such as France and Germany, the United States and the United Kingdom led a coalition to invade Iraq. The invasion commenced in mid-March 2003 with a bombing campaign codenamed Shock and Awe. Coalition ground forces, alongside allied Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, moved into Iraq from the south and north. The Iraqi military offered minimal resistance and collapsed within 3 weeks. On the 9th of April, 2003, coalition forces entered Baghdad, symbolizing the fall of the regime.
When I saw the statue fall on television, I did not cheer. I just cried. I cried for my father, for my uncles, for all the people who did not live to see that day. It felt impossible. For so long, he was more than a man. He was like a dark god. And to see him pulled down into the dirt, it was the first time in my life I felt something like hope.
For me, it was a day of profound shame. Not because I loved Saddam, but because I loved Iraq. To see our capital occupied by foreign soldiers, it was the ultimate failure. Everything the Ba'ath Party had promised, strength, dignity, independence. It all ended with American tanks in Ferdo Square.
As the capital fell, Saddam Hussein, his family, and senior members of the Ba'athist Party fled into hiding. The U.S. military created a deck of playing cards featuring images of the 52 most wanted Iraqis to aid in their capture. Saddam was designated the Ace of Spades. His sons, Uday and Qusay, were located and killed in a raid in Mosul in July 2003. Saddam himself remained at large for several months. On the 13th of December 2003, he was captured by U.S. forces near a farmhouse in the vicinity of Tikrit, discovered hiding in a small underground chamber. Saddam Hussein was transferred to the custody of the Iraqi interim government to stand trial. He was tried before the Iraqi Special Tribunal for crimes against humanity, with the first case focusing on the 1982 Dujail massacre. The trial commenced on the 19th of October 2005. Throughout the proceedings, Saddam refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court. On the 5th of November 2006, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was carried out on the 30th of December 2006. The fall of Saddam Hussein's regime did not lead to stability in Iraq. In the years following the 2003 invasion, the country descended into a complex and violent civil war, characterized by a potent insurgency against coalition forces and widespread sectarian conflict. While the invasion achieved the removal of a brutal dictator, its long-term consequences for Iraq and the wider region have been profound and enduring. Saddam Hussein's tenure represents a disastrous period in Iraqi history, defined by authoritarianism, destructive wars, and systematic human rights abuses. Saddam Hussein's legacy is one of war, terror, and a nation left in ruins. Was he a unique product of his time and place? Or does his story hold universal warnings about the nature of power and tyranny? Share your final thoughts in the comments. And if you've made it this far, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth documentaries on the figures who have shaped our world.